This photograph was taken in Birmingham, Alabama, on May 3, 1963. A police officer is restraining his German Shepherd as it lunges at a young black man. The dog's teeth are bared. The man is trying to back away, but he has nowhere to go. This wasn't a crime scene. This was a protest. Peaceful demonstrators, many of them children, were marching for their civil rights. And the city of Birmingham responded with police dogs and fire hoses. The images that came out of Birmingham in May 1963 shocked the world. They exposed the brutal reality of segregation in America. They proved that the fight for civil rights wasn't about abstract principles. It was about human beings facing violence for demanding basic dignity. And they changed everything. Let's go back to where it started. The most segregated city in America. By 1963, Birmingham, Alabama had earned a reputation as the most segregated city in the United States. The city's public safety commissioner, Bull Connor, was a die-hard segregationist who vowed that integration would never happen in his city. Everything in Birmingham was divided by race. Schools were segregated. Restaurants were segregated. Water fountains, restrooms, waiting rooms, all segregated. Black citizens couldn't sit at lunch counters in downtown stores. They couldn't try on clothes before buying them. They had to use separate entrances, marked, colored. The city had closed all public parks rather than integrate them. They removed the benches from bus stops so black and white citizens wouldn't sit together. They even made it illegal for black and white people to play checkers together. But segregation wasn't just about separation. It was about power, about control, about maintaining white supremacy through intimidation and violence. Birmingham had a dark history. Between 1957 and 1963, there were over 50 racially motivated bombings in the city's black neighborhoods. So many explosions that the city earned the nickname Bombingham. Black homes, black churches, black businesses, all targets. The Ku Klux Klan operated openly in Birmingham. Police were often complicit in the violence, sometimes actively participating. When black citizens reported crimes, police ignored them. When they fought back, police arrested them. The local economy depended on cheap black labor in steel mills and factories. Black workers did the hardest, most dangerous jobs for the lowest wages. They had no recourse, no protection, no power. By 1963, Birmingham's black community had reached a breaking point. Years of petitions, negotiations, and peaceful protests had produced nothing. The city refused to budge. Bull Connor refused to budge, so civil rights leaders decided it was time for direct action. Project C. Confrontation. In January 1963, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, a Birmingham civil rights leader, invited Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to Birmingham. They developed a plan, Project C. The C stood for confrontation. The goal was simple but ambitious: force Birmingham to desegregate through massive, sustained, nonviolent protest. Fill the jails. Disrupt business. Make the city's racism so visible, so undeniable, that the federal government would have to intervene. King knew Birmingham would be dangerous. Shuttlesworth himself had survived multiple assassination attempts. His home had been bombed. His church had been bombed. He'd been beaten with chains and brass knuckles. But King also knew that Birmingham was the key. If they could break segregation in the most segregated city in America, they could break it anywhere. The campaign was scheduled to begin on April 3, 1963. They would start with sit-ins at downtown lunch counters, followed by marches to City Hall, economic boycotts of white businesses, and mass demonstrations. They expected arrests. They expected violence. But they were committed to nonviolence no matter what happened. On April 3rd, the first sit-ins began. 20 volunteers sat down at segregated lunch counters. They were arrested immediately. The next day, more sit-ins, more arrests. On April 6th, a march to City Hall began. Bull Connor ordered police to block the marchers. 42 people were arrested, including Shuttlesworth. On April 10th, a state judge issued an injunction banning all protests and marches. King faced a choice: obey the court order or defy it and risk being jailed. He chose to march. Letter from Birmingham Jail. On April 12, 1963, Good Friday, Martin Luther King Jr. led a march in defiance of the court order. He wore denim work clothes, the uniform of poor laborers, to show solidarity with Birmingham's working-class black community. Police arrested King almost immediately. He was thrown into solitary confinement in Birmingham jail, held in a dark, narrow cell with no mattress. While in jail, King read a newspaper article. 8 white Alabama clergymen had published a statement calling the protests unwise and untimely. They urged black citizens to be patient, to negotiate quietly, to wait for change to come gradually. King was furious. Patient? Black Americans had been patient for 300 years. The clergyman's statement represented everything King was fighting against. White moderates who valued order over justice, who told oppressed people to wait a little longer, to be less disruptive. So King began to write, on scraps of newspaper, on toilet paper, on any surface he could find. He composed what would become one of the most important documents of the civil rights movement. Letter from Birmingham Jail. In the letter, King explained why they couldn't wait. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. He addressed the white moderates directly. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who was more devoted to order than to justice. He defended the right to break unjust laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws, and he explained why Birmingham, why now. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. King was released on bail on April 20th, but the campaign was struggling. Despite daily protests, the media coverage was limited. The jails were filling up, but not fast enough to create the crisis they needed. Money for bail was running out. Volunteers were getting tired, getting scared. The movement needed something dramatic, something that would capture national attention. So they made a controversial decision. They would recruit children. The Children's Crusade. On May 2, 1963, over 1,000 black children and teenagers gathered at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. Some were in high school. Some were in elementary school. Some were as young as 6 years old. They had been trained in nonviolent resistance. They knew they would be arrested. Many had written out wills, just in case. They left notes for their parents, explaining why they had to march. At 1 p.m., the church doors opened. The children poured out, singing freedom songs. They marched toward downtown Birmingham in waves, group after group after group. Bull Connor was waiting. He ordered mass arrests. Police wagons pulled up. Officers grabbed children by their arms, their shirts, their hair, and threw them into the wagons. The children didn't resist. They went limp, forcing officers to drag them. They sang as they were arrested. They sang as they were loaded into police vans. They sang all the way to jail. By the end of the day, over 600 children had been arrested. The jails were overflowing. Police had to use the fairgrounds to hold them. Some Americans were horrified that the movement was using children. Malcolm X called it immoral. Even some civil rights supporters questioned the tactic. Were children being exploited? Were they being put in danger? But King defended the decision. These children were already in danger every day they lived under segregation. They attended inferior schools. They faced discrimination and humiliation. They deserved the chance to fight for their own freedom. And the children themselves were clear about why they were there. One young girl told reporters, "We're tired of being pushed around. We want to be free." The next day, May 3rd, even more children gathered at 16th Street Baptist Church, over 1,000 of them, ready to march again. This time, Bull Connor had a different plan. Fire hoses and attack dogs. When the children began to march on May 3rd, Bull Connor didn't just arrest them. He decided to stop them by any means necessary. He ordered firefighters to turn high-pressure fire hoses on the marchers. The water pressure was so strong it could strip bark off trees. It tore clothes off bodies. It sent children tumbling down the street like rag dolls. The force of the water knocked people down, slammed them against buildings, rolled them across pavement. Some children were injured badly enough to require hospitalization. Skin was scraped raw. Bones were bruised or broken. Still, the children kept coming. They would get knocked down, pick themselves up, and try to march forward again. They linked arms to resist the water. They sang freedom songs even as the hoses blasted them. Then Connor brought out the dogs. Birmingham police had a K9 unit, German shepherds trained to attack on command. Connor ordered officers to use the dogs on the protesters. Police unleashed the dogs on teenagers, on young adults, on anyone who tried to march. The dogs lunged at protesters, teeth bared, snarling. They bit arms, legs, torsos. They tore clothing and flesh. One photograph captured the moment perfectly. A police officer restraining his German shepherd as it attacked a young black man. The man's shirt was torn. He was trying to back away. But the dog was relentless, and the officer was allowing it. Another photograph showed a young man, Walter Gadsden, being attacked by a police dog while an officer held him. Gadsden wasn't fighting back. He wasn't resisting. He was simply standing there as the dog's teeth sank into his abdomen. Press photographers captured it all. Bill Hudson, a photographer for the Associated Press, took dozens of photos that day. Bob Edelman captured the chaos. Charles Moore shot images that would appear in Life magazine. The photographs showed American police brutalizing unarmed children and teenagers. They showed the violence of segregation, the cruelty of racism, the reality of what Black Americans faced every day. By the end of May 3rd, over 250 more children had been arrested. Hundreds more were injured. The jails were beyond capacity. Bull Connor announced he would use the state fairgrounds as a makeshift prison, but Connor had made a fatal mistake. He had created exactly the images the civil rights movement needed. The world sees Birmingham. The photographs from Birmingham appeared on front pages around the world. Americans eating breakfast saw images of children being attacked by dogs. Europeans watching the evening news saw teenagers being blasted by fire hoses. People across the globe saw the brutal reality of American racism. President John F. Kennedy said the photos made him sick. He told advisors that the image of dogs attacking protesters had damaged America's reputation around the world, especially in Africa and Asia, where the United States was trying to win allies in the Cold War. How could America claim to be the leader of the free world when it was using dogs and fire hoses on its own citizens? The photographs appeared in Life magazine, showing the full horror of Birmingham to millions of Americans. Charles Moore's images were particularly powerful. One showed a police officer's knee and a woman's neck. Another showed a teenage boy being slammed by water from a fire hose. International newspapers published the photos with damning headlines. Soviet propaganda seized on the images, using them to argue that American democracy was a sham. How could the United States criticize the Soviet Union when it treated its own black citizens this way? In Birmingham itself, the white business community began to panic. The protests were devastating downtown commerce. Stores were empty. The city's reputation was destroyed. National companies were reconsidering doing business in Birmingham. And still the protests continued. Day after day, children marched. Day after day, they were arrested, beaten, blasted with water, attacked by dogs. Day after day, they sang freedom songs and refused to back down. On May 4th, thousands more protesters filled the streets. Fire hoses knocked them down. Dogs bit them. Police clubbed them. But they kept coming. By May 5th, the jails held over 3,000 people, most of them children and teenagers. There was no more room. Bull Connor was running out of options. Behind the scenes, Birmingham's business leaders began secret negotiations with civil rights leaders. They couldn't sustain this anymore. The national attention was destroying the city. They needed a way out. On May 10, 1963, an agreement was reached. Downtown stores would desegregate their lunch counters, restrooms, and drinking fountains. Stores would hire black employees in positions previously reserved for whites. All protesters arrested during the campaign would be released. It wasn't everything the movement wanted, but it was progress. Real, tangible progress in the most segregated city in America. Martin Luther King Jr. called it the most magnificent victory for justice we've ever seen in the Deep South. But the victory came at a cost, the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church. Not everyone in Birmingham was happy about the agreement. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups saw it as a betrayal, a surrender to the demands of outside agitators. On May 11th, the night after the agreement was announced, bombs exploded at the home of King's brother, Reverend A.D. King, and at the Gaston Motel, where civil rights leaders were staying. Both targets were hit in an obvious attempt to kill movement leaders. Miraculously, no one was killed. Riots broke out in Birmingham's black neighborhoods. Years of anger and frustration exploded. Buildings were burned. Police cars were overturned. Alabama Governor George Wallace sent state troopers into the city to restore order. The violence continued throughout the summer. White supremacists firebombed black homes and churches. The agreement to desegregate was implemented slowly, grudgingly, with many businesses trying to find ways around it. Then, on September 15th, 1963, came the worst tragedy of all. It was a Sunday morning. Children were attending Sunday school at 16th Street Baptist Church, the same church that had served as headquarters for the children's marches in May. At 10:22 a.m., a bomb exploded beneath the church steps, right next to the basement, where children were preparing for the 11 o'clock service. The blast tore through the building. It blew out the church's stained glass windows. It buried children under falling bricks and debris. 4 girls were killed. Addie Mae Collins, 14 years old. Denise McNair, 11 years old. Carol Robertson, 14 years old. Cynthia Wesley, 14 years old. They had been in the church basement, putting on their choir robes. The bomb killed them instantly. 22 others were injured, including Sarah Collins, Addie Mae's younger sister, who lost her right eye in the blast. The bombing horrified the nation. These weren't protesters. They weren't marchers. They were children in church, preparing to worship God. And someone had murdered them for the color of their skin. Dr. King delivered the eulogy at a joint funeral for 3 of the girls. He said, "These children, unoffending, innocent, and beautiful, were the victims of one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity." He continued, "They did not die in vain. God still has a way of wringing good out of evil. And history has proven over and over again that unmerited suffering is redemptive. The innocent blood of these little girls may well serve as a redemptive force that will bring new light to this dark city." The bombing became a turning point. Even many white Americans who had been indifferent to civil rights were shocked into action. The murder of 4 little girls in church was too much to ignore, too much to justify. The impact. Civil Rights Act of 1964. The photographs from Birmingham in May 1963, combined with the bombing in September, created unstoppable momentum for federal civil rights legislation. President Kennedy, who had been cautious about civil rights, gave a nationally televised address on June 11, 1963. He called civil rights a moral issue and announced that he would send comprehensive civil rights legislation to Congress. Kennedy said, "We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities." He continued, 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, before the bill could pass. But his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, made civil rights his top priority. On July 2, 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. The act banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It ended segregation in public places. It prohibited unequal application of voter registration requirements. It prohibited discrimination in employment. The law wasn't perfect. It would take years to implement fully. Resistance continued throughout the South, but it was a monumental achievement, the most significant civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. And it happened in large part because of what happened in Birmingham in May 1963. The photographs of children being attacked by dogs and fire hoses had done what years of patient negotiation could not. They had forced America to confront the reality of segregation. They had made the invisible visible. They had turned moral outrage into political action. The power of the image. Why were the photographs from Birmingham so powerful? First, they showed children as victims. Americans were used to seeing civil rights protests framed as adults causing trouble, disrupting order. But these were children, innocent, vulnerable, sympathetic. Seeing them attacked by dogs and fire hoses was shocking in a way that images of adult protesters were not. Second, the images revealed the violence inherent in segregation. For many white Americans, particularly those living outside the South, segregation was an abstract concept. They knew it existed, but they didn't see it, didn't feel it. The Birmingham photographs made the violence concrete. They showed what it actually looked like when a government used force to maintain racial oppression. Third, the photographs contradicted the narrative that segregationists had been promoting. Bull Connor and other Southern politicians claimed that Black Americans were happy with segregation, that outside agitators were causing trouble. But the images showed a different reality. Black Americans, including children, were willing to face dogs and fire hoses for the chance to be treated as equal human beings. Fourth, the photographs put international pressure on the United States. During the Cold War, America claimed moral superiority over the Soviet Union. But how could America criticize Soviet oppression when it was oppressing its own citizens? The Birmingham photographs damaged America's credibility around the world, giving the federal government a powerful incentive to act. The power of these images wasn't just in what they showed. It was in who saw them. In 1963, television was becoming the dominant medium for news. Families across America watched the Birmingham protests unfold on their TV screens. They saw it happen in real time. They couldn't look away, and they couldn't deny what they were seeing. The people behind the images. Let's talk about some of the people captured in these photographs. Walter Gadsden, the young man attacked by the police dog in one of the most famous photos, wasn't even a protester. He was a 15-year-old high school student who had skipped school to watch the demonstrations. He got caught up in the crowd when police released the dogs. In the photograph, Gadsden appears calm, almost passive, as the dog attacks him. That wasn't courage. It was shock. He told interviewers later that he was terrified, that he thought he was going to die. But in the moment, he froze. The photograph made Gadsden instantly famous, but he didn't want the attention. He struggled with being recognized, with having that moment of terror define his life. Years later, he reflected that the photograph helped the civil rights movement, but it cost him his privacy and his sense of normalcy. Bill Hudson, the photographer who took the most iconic image of the dog attack, was a white Southerner working for the Associated Press. He later said that what he saw in Birmingham changed his life, that he couldn't be neutral anymore after witnessing such brutality. Hudson took hundreds of photos that day, but the image of the dog attack became the most reproduced photograph of the civil rights movement. It appeared on the cover of newspapers around the world. It won awards. It became a symbol of the struggle for civil rights. The police officer in the photo, Dick Middleton, held his dog back just enough to create a dramatic image, but not enough to prevent the attack entirely. He later defended his actions, claiming he was just doing his job, maintaining order. He never expressed regret. The children who marched, thousands of them, showed extraordinary courage. They knew they would be arrested. They knew they might be hurt. But they marched anyway. Many of them carried those experiences for the rest of their lives. Some became lifelong activists. Others tried to put it behind them, to move on. All of them contributed to a moment that changed history. Bull Connor's defeat. Bull Connor thought he could crush the civil rights movement with force. He thought fire hoses and dogs would intimidate protesters into submission. He thought national audiences would see the protests as riots and side with law enforcement. He was catastrophically wrong. Every image of children being attacked undermined his position. Every photograph of dogs biting protesters proved what civil rights leaders had been saying: segregation was maintained through violence and terror. Connor's brutal tactics didn't crush the movement. They energized it. They turned Birmingham into a symbol of Southern racism. They made desegregation inevitable. Connor tried to defend his actions. He claimed he was protecting the city from outside agitators. He said the protesters were violent, that he had to use force to maintain order. He blamed the media for distorting what happened. But the photographs told a different story. They showed children singing freedom songs as they were arrested. They showed teenagers being knocked down by fire hoses. They showed young adults being attacked by dogs. The photographs didn't lie, and they destroyed Bull Connor's credibility. Connor lost his position as Public Safety Commissioner later in 1963. He tried to run for office again but was defeated. He spent the rest of his life as a symbol of the brutality of segregation, a cautionary tale about the consequences of using violence to maintain injustice. He died in 1973, never admitting he was wrong, never apologizing for what he had done. The legacy, unfinished business. The Birmingham Campaign succeeded in forcing desegregation in Alabama's most segregated city. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation nationwide. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected Black Americans' right to vote. These were monumental achievements, victories that changed American society fundamentally. But the work wasn't finished. Economic inequality persisted. Housing discrimination continued. Police brutality remained a reality for Black Americans. Systemic racism adapted, finding new forms even as old ones were banned. Today, Birmingham has a civil rights memorial. The 16th Street Baptist Church, rebuilt after the bombing, is a national historic landmark. A civil rights institute tells the story of the movement and the children who marched. But Birmingham also remains a deeply segregated city, economically and residentially. Black and white residents still live in different neighborhoods, attend different schools, have vastly different economic opportunities. The photographs from Birmingham in 1963 remind us that progress requires sacrifice, that change doesn't come easily, and that images have power to move hearts and change minds. They also remind us that children can be agents of change, that young people can stand up to injustice even when adults are too afraid or too complicit. The children who marched in Birmingham showed courage that most adults couldn't muster. They faced dogs and fire hoses. They went to jail. They risked their lives. And they won. Conclusion. The photograph that changed America. When you look at the photograph of the police dog attacking a young Black man in Birmingham, remember what it represents. It represents the violence required to maintain segregation, the brutality at the heart of Jim Crow. It represents children willing to face that violence for the chance to be treated as equal human beings. It represents the power of images to expose injustice, to change public opinion, to force political action. It represents a turning point in American history, the moment when the civil rights movement's message became undeniable. But it also represents unfinished business. The dog attack happened in 1963. Over 60 years have passed, and Black Americans still face police violence, still face systemic racism, still fight for justice. The children who marched in Birmingham are elderly now, if they're still alive, but their legacy continues. Every protest for racial justice echoes Birmingham. Every march for civil rights follows in the footsteps of those children. Every person who stands up to injustice carries forward their courage. The photographs from Birmingham didn't end racism, but they proved that racism could be defeated, that segregation could be dismantled, that justice could prevail. They proved that ordinary people, even children, could stand up to power and win. They proved that bearing witness matters, that documenting injustice matters, that showing the world the truth matters. The photograph of the police dog attacking a young man is more than just an image. It's a testament to the courage of those who fought for civil rights. It's a reminder of how far we've come, and it's a challenge to finish the work they started. 4 little girls died in 16th Street Baptist Church because of the color of their skin. Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley. They deserved to grow up, to live full lives, to see the world change. They didn't get that chance, but their deaths, like the photographs from the children's marches, helped create the world we live in today. A world where segregation is illegal, where Black Americans can vote without facing violence, where lunch counters are open to everyone. It's not the world those 4 girls should have grown up in, a world where they never would have been in danger in the first place. But it's better than the world they died in. And it's our responsibility to keep making it better. The dog in the photograph represents everything that was wrong with America in 1963. The young man trying to back away represents the dignity and courage of those who refused to accept injustice. That image shocked the world. It changed America. And it reminds us, more than 60 years later, that bearing witness to injustice is the first step toward ending it. The children of Birmingham faced dogs and fire hoses. They went to jail by the thousands. They were beaten and brutalized. But they didn't stop. They didn't give up. And they won. Their victory wasn't complete. The struggle continues. But their courage, their sacrifice, their willingness to face violence for the cause of justice, that legacy lives on. In every protest, in every march, in every person who refuses to be silent in the face of injustice. The photographs from Birmingham in May 1960 are more than historical documents. They're a call to action, a reminder that change is possible, a testament to the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, and a challenge to all of us to carry forward the work those children began, because the fight for justice is never finished. And the photographs from Birmingham remind us that every generation has to fight that fight again, with courage, with persistence, with a refusal to accept injustice, just like the children of Birmingham in 1963.